Now that we've talked about how we created the 1982 Constitution, we're going to move into talking about attempts to change it. So the first attempt to shift the 1982 Constitution comes in 1987 under Brian Mulroney. It's called the Meech Lake Accords, and we'll talk a little bit about what it was supposed to do. So this is intended as an accord that the population of Quebec, the provincial government of Quebec, can sign. The phrase that Mulroney uses here is with dignity. And this is actually an appealing idea, both from sort of a nationalist sentiment inside Quebec perspective, because they figured it was going to address their concerns about having lost a provincial veto, all of that kind of stuff, and sort of to create a formalized place for a francophone nation within Canada, which Trudeau wasn't willing to do. Mulroney and Trudeau have different sort of ideas about what's going on in the country. And then outside of Quebec, it is sort of perceived as an opportunity to bring Quebec into the fold, as it were, to sort of get everyone on the same page. And that sort of idea of national unity is really, really appealing. This is the first test of our amendment formula from 1982, and we'll sort of talk about what that looks like. And the main driver of this accord really is about that sort of space around sort of Quebec's place in the Constitution. But there are some other little things that they are looking to resolve and formalize at the same time. Related to the idea of Quebec's place in Constitution, they're looking at sort of formalizing some questions around Supreme Court justices. So for those of you who do not know, if you remember, we talked about this way back at the beginning, that the Quebec Act of 1774 gave Canada a single criminal code, but allowed the province of Quebec to continue using the French civil code, so the French codes governing contracts and negotiations and that kind of stuff, where the sort of criminal penalties are the same across the country. For that reason, because you have two different civil traditions, right? You have the Anglophone one and the Francophone one working in the same country. The tradition had been for a really long time to have at least 3 of the 9 justices on the Canadian Supreme Court be from Quebec. Not necessarily because Quebec's laws are more important, but because having 3 justices from Quebec on the same Supreme Court gave the possibility of being able to hear cases from Quebec in the civil law tradition, because you cannot have only one person who can judge that. That's not how Supreme Courts work. They work in tribunals of 3, 5, 7, or 9, depending on sort of how many people need to be involved. So 3 was sort of understood as a way to ensure that experts in that legal tradition would be available. So one of the changes in 1987 was aimed at sort of resolving that particular piece. And the other one that they're sort of looking to resolve here is how to talk about federal spending in provincial jurisdictions. So we talked a little bit about constitutional challenges and remaining constitutional issues around, for example, what on earth does it mean to have a Canada Health Act when the federal government has larger possibilities of taxation, but the provincial governments are the ones who are supposed to deliver health care, and how do you deal with the reality that what that basically means is the federal government pays the provincial governments to go along with whatever they think is important in healthcare. So we've got some limitations in that sort of space. And those are sort of the main things that they're looking to change. As far as it goes in terms of structure and what this looks like, what this constitutional agreement does, and when we sort of start talking about the Meech Lake Accords, what we're talking about is a First Minister's Conference where Prime Minister Mulroney calls all of the premiers, they sit in a room, they talk through what might work, and sort of some rough principles about what that agreement might look like, and then everyone is expected to go back to their respective houses of government to negotiate what's going on here, to sort of pass these agreements. So Mulroney is supposed to go back to Ottawa and help get those accords passed through the House of Commons and then Senate, and all the premiers are supposed to go home and get them passed through their provincial legislatures. Okay, so what this looks like in sort of understanding the shifts here, the Meech Lake Accords recognize Quebec as a distinct society. That's the phrasing within Canada. And this sort of makes that Supreme Court conversation a requirement. And it makes a transition to solve what Quebec identified as a problem with the loss of their sort of traditional veto on major legislative and constitutional changes. So if you remember when we sort of talked about the 1982 Constitution, one of the complaints from Quebec is that they perceived that they had always had a veto to sort of say, no, that doesn't represent the influence, that doesn't reflect the interests of the Francophone population of this country, you can't do it. And the sort of response, and like Trudeau was intentionally trying to get rid of that. He has this idea about the need for a strong federal government. When we talk about the Meech Lake Accords, the solution there is to get rid of that sort of that problem with a veto, but essentially to give it to everyone and to sort of solve the problem, because the tension around that is that many Anglophone provinces would have been really upset and would never have passed an agreement that said, oh, well, Quebec gets its own special veto on constitutional changes. So the workaround here is to say, okay, and we're going to scrap that 7 provinces with at least 50% of the population thing. We're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to shift our amendment formula so that every province needs to pass it, which gives back Quebec its veto by giving everyone a veto. And that's sort of a way to balance those two needs. Quebec really likes this idea, but the recognition of Quebec as a distinct society frustrates many people in many other provinces, including many politicians, who perceive that as a violation of the equality of provinces. It sort of is a way of, they don't like that it sort of puts Quebec in a different category than everyone else. And they also sort of see that idea about creating a distinct society for Quebec as being a grounds potentially for another referendum. And the other sort of challenge that kind of comes up out of that is going back to some of the concerns that Canadian politicians had when they created Confederation in the first place, which was that creating that idea of a distinct society for a single province had the potential to sort of build in challenges and responses from other places in the country that would also be interested in separating, i.e. Alberta separatism, and sort of, and that potential for that kind of separation could lead to the picking off of provinces one at a time to join the United States that was a going concern in 1850. So that's kind of the Meech Lake Accord. I had intended to do Elijah Harper in this video, but I'm going to give Elijah Harper his own video, which we're going to look at just next, and then after that we'll get to Charlottetown.